Aloha and welcome. Welcome to Global Connections, part of the ThinkTech Hawaii series here. I'm delighted to welcome a guest who's been on our show before and is going to be with us today for a great conversation, Marc Gilbert. Dr. Marc Gilbert is a professor of world history, and our show today is titled World War in World History. We're going to unravel a great set of details. We're at a critical juncture today in the year 2014. It's a 100-year anniversary from the beginning of World War I. And of course, this past century, we've seen quite a bit of, different wars. We live today in an age where we have a war on terror, and we occasionally have the war on drugs, and who knows whatever else. But the focus for us will be really understanding world wars. Dr. Gilbert is joining us. I want to thank you, Marc, once again for coming. And in particular, I'd like to have you kind of maybe at the outset, some of our listeners may not be aware of what you've done, but tell us briefly your area of expertise and what you do here in Hawaii.
Well, I'm a holder of National Endowment for Humanities Chair in World History at HPU, one of the first chairs that HPU has ever had. And the idea is that Hawaii Pacific University is very committed to global learning and global citizenship. And war is one of those things that brings to the fore a great deal of issues about identity, about citizenship, about nationhood.
Yeah. Excellent. No, and you've you had an opportunity just recently to return. You did some presentations in China. Tell us a little bit about that. Where were you?
Well, World War I and World War II kind of anniversaries are merging together.
Yeah.
2015, 1945. Of course, August 1914. So those issues came up, and in the past year, I've been invited to conferences and to academies of social science to talk about these world wars in terms of world history. In Vietnam in May, and in Beijing just this July and August.
Oh, excellent. And of course, in many ways, you define this notion of world history. Tell us a little bit, what does that mean? The idea, because you're a professor of world history, and we're talking about World War and world history. Is that any different from regular history or other history? I mean, what can you just explain?
Well, you could argue it's the first history, because if you look at every religious text, it always begins with a universal concept that we're all together. But in the 19th century, when the profession of history became kind of a rational scientific discipline of study, this is the heyday, or really the establishment of the nation state.
Yeah.
So the result of that was that all histories became oriented towards national histories. And so we went away from the idea of looking at how we all fit together to an idea in which how we're all particular, very different from each other.
Yeah.
And of course we never were. I mean, the idea of a French state, well, what is it French? Is it to be Catholic? These things have to be worked out. The United States had a civil war over what its nature was supposed to be. So the nation state is relatively new, but it's like a tide that rolled over the history profession.
Yeah.
And in the 1980s, some of us got together, some of us who were trained in multiple area studies, rather than just Africa or the United States or Europe, but who had research fields in both areas. And we said, we really, the only history worth learning in an age of globalization is a global history, to look at the world as a globe with people on it, instead of looking at it as a nation state with an exceptional one exceptional person in it, one exceptional nation, which every nation feels that way.
Yeah, and actually that touches on this idea. Often the perception we have of world wars, we specifically refer to, and as we study them, World War I, this great war. At the time, it wasn't known as World War I; it was the Great War. And then to be followed by World War II. Now we've had, of course, since then a number of other wars and conflicts, but I guess one of the things that we can speak to briefly is, the end of World War II, now we're well past 60 years, it also establishes a global system, a framework that the U.S. would be a key part in shaping. But we fast forward to where we are now, and it's a world where there are a lot of pressures put on that, and different challenges. There's a lot of tension and conflict. And you look at the headlines today, and it can be pretty daunting, pretty scary. Conflicts in Ukraine and Syria and Iraq and Central Africa, and yet we've managed to come this far without a World War III. I mean, what is it about the nature of war, maybe in this past half century, that's clearly different from these past world wars?
Well, a world historian would not take that position. An international relations specialist would. For a world historian, in the 20th century, we had one world war, and it's continuing.
Yeah.
It had a second chapter in the Second World War, but if you look at the Middle East, which was the lines of the Middle East that are fracturing now, are the ones that were put together as part of the the settlement of World War I.
There really is a connection, a link. It hasn't quite been resolved or ended in that respect.
No, and that's one of the biggest issues about a global war, which is people usually think that whatever war they're facing in a large scale, they think they will have the ability to address it and resolve it. They will win, and then everything will be fine. But they don't realize that things will never be the same. And unfortunately, nations looking at possible conflicts aren't looking 100 years ahead or even 20 years ahead. The world that Vladimir Putin is building in Russia today and the Ukraine is going to look very, very different, regardless of what outcome that this tension is going to have. There are masses of people at a Russian airbase saying, I'm seeing photographs of our sons and our husbands in Ukraine pretending to be local dissidents. Why are they there? These are Russian regular troops? Our children are in a Russian regular army. Why are they pretending to be something they're not? And I don't think Putin, when he began doing this, had any idea that there might be such a blowback, largely because people in his position think that they can deal with it. They think they have the power to be able to deal with it. They never do. It's never sufficient.
And maybe the question I would ask of you, this is a challenge. I mean, as an international relations scholar myself, I mean, we're always trying to bring some analysis, some explanation of why nations go to war. Now, as a historian, you see it from the big picture. I mean, we've always had conflicts of some type, but they've changed and evolved. But I mean, what are some of the prevailing explanations or reasons? I mean, what brings people to war? You mentioned the nation state, which is of course an important concept, but we live in an age today where now we have conflicts from more elusive social movements or things that don't always have an easy return address, or I don't know. I mean, my sense is that we're seeing different types of conflicts on some level. But there's no singular reason, and yet we want that. We want nice, neat explanations. We want we want a victory. We want the end of a war.
Well, you want at least an ideological focus or something like that. But it would be a mistake to see these from a world historical perspective. These are not contemporary issues. Islam appeared, offering a new way of organizing society back more than in the 1670s, 1630s. It was established as an empire, or established itself as an empire, and it spread around the world. It created a vast world empire, one of the greatest in all of human history, and then it fractured and was devoured by the West. So you could ask, for example, the Islamic State that's trying to be created out of the desert, not quite, of course, is trying to build a new state. Well, nation building, as we talk a lot about that, we just want to build inside nations that already exist because we don't think we can handle new nations. We don't have any method. So instead we call it non-state, we call it terrorism, but we have all sorts of names for things that have existed before, but outside the concept of the nation state. So what I'm trying to say is we're prisoners of the idea of a nation state. And unfortunately, since the nation state isn't perfect, almost all of our troubles come from new nations trying to find their way into the system, which is what made Japan and Germany outlaws and caused 2 world wars, because they were not part of the initial expansion of the Western nation states, and those nation states decided to keep them out and put them in an inferior status. Now we see those problems. We also see failed states. That is, as colonial systems dissolved, it left behind vestiges of states. People who never were in a nation state together were now found within one. And of course, Iraq is a perfect example of that. And it's a perfectly manufactured state. It had no, even under the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't Iraq.
And so you look at it today, I mean, when the intervention of the U.S. took place there in 2003, very controversial that it was, but there was also talk early on, well, should it be broken into 3, and what is the solution? And even today, given the continuing crisis there, what is the solution? And these are some challenges. And again, for us, it's incumbent to understand some of that context and some of the history to know that while we have a modern state of Iraq today, it really is not a you know, it's an artificial creation, right? I mean, I don't know if this was one of those that the former leaders carved up on a
Actually,
on a
Winston
napkin.
Churchill did, yes.
Quite literally.
Yes, quite literally.
And you know, and so when you look and try to understand where these tensions are playing out, and again, maybe it's in Ukraine where we think of it as this cohesive singular nation. Really, it's a divided country with a very clear Russian, you know, dominated population on the east side, but Iraq, for that matter. These are places where people's identity is first and foremost tribal, more immediate to their identity of, you know. How would you explain some of that?
Well, one of our problems with the word tribal is what we're really looking at is a nation that isn't one. In other words, if you look at what a definition of a nation state is, which is a society within a border in which people have a common sense of their past and a common identity, not always a single religion, but at least an understanding of people within this society have this religion, and it also has an idea of what it should be in the future. And when it's small, we often call those tribes, but they're not. And we often look at them like, well, they're clan organized. That is, who you're married to has more to do with another. Well, really, the Bushes, you know, the Gandhis, the Indira and Rajiv. I mean, there are plenty of states which identify with powerful families. So really, what you're talking about is a modern society which has its own bureaucratic aspects, its organization, a more traditional society which has a different kind of organization. But I think it's wrong to, I mean, look what's happening. Remember, there was, I don't think it was Cavour, but it was someone of the Risorgimento in Italy, as Italy emerged from a non-state to a state. That is, it was part of Austria, part of France, and it created its own nation. And one of the leaders said, of course Italy will be a nation. There wasn't a nation of Italy, so there must be a nation of Italy, right? Because the Italian people are great people. They must have a nation. And you can argue the Kurds have been saying that for years. It's the largest populated area which does not have its own state. Well, would we say the Kurds cannot have their own state? Well, they may, because one of the unanticipated aspects of this is unfortunately for them, the Kurds will be even more militarized than they are and never integrated back into Iraq or any other nation, and in a way that would determine the future of the Kurds. Although that may not happen. That you never know the outcome of history. It's one of the reasons not to get into such messes, because you can never predict what the outcome's going to be. And the more you think you can control it or know it, the less likely, the less prepared you will be for the future.
Well, on that note, let's take a short break, and we're going to return. We're talking today with Dr. Marc Gilbert, a world historian, and we'll return to talk more about some of the lessons and consequences of world wars. And so join us for more on the story.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard, and I host the show Center Stage on the ThinkTech Hawaii digital series right here every Wednesday from 2 to 3 Hawaii time. I would really love to have you watch the show and see what we do here. I talk with some of the most amazing people, artists, most of them, all of them involved in some sort of artistic process. And our goal here on the show is to dig into that artistic process, and you would not believe what some people say, what some people do, what people go through to express. And these are people who have to express somehow, and I find that infinitely interesting. Not only that they have to express, but how they end up doing it. I really hope that you will watch the show and enjoy talking with some of these people the same way that I do. Thanks, and I hope to see you soon on Center Stage on the ThinkTech Hawaii digital series, Wednesdays from 2 to 3. See you soon.
Aloha, welcome. We're back and we're live. I'm Carlos Juarez, your host here on Global Connections, and joining me today, Marc Gilbert, a world historian who's just recently come back from China. And Marc, we've been talking about world wars and world history, and I wanted to maybe ask if you could share us a quick overview. You presented some work in China recently. Tell us about what you were doing there.
Well, the reason why there's discussion in China about the First World War in particular is that China was on the victorious side in the First World War, and instead the old German colonies were transferred to Japan, and that will eventually lead to what they call the Great Anti-Japanese Resistance War of 1931 and 1945. And I think probably most people in the world know how tense relations are between Japan and China. But China is very determined that its own people, and I'm quoting here, get the correct view of Chinese-Japanese relations. Japan is an aggressor, guilty of horrendous war crimes against Japan. But that correct view, not necessarily incorrect, but the problem is to get everyone to have this view means there's no check on the emotions that are raised. And in China, it's a joke amongst middle class and intellectuals in China, but if you turn on all the channels they have in China, all of them seem to be about the Second World War or the Japanese doing really horrible and nasty things, executing people, but also espionage stories, you know, heroic Chinese agents being revealed. There's been a wonderful Hollywood movie about that. Or in any event, the point I'm trying to get at is that there can't be any dissent for the correct view, and therefore the Chinese people don't understand not just the complexities of conflict, but they don't know how to handle the peace. For example, we did our best in Japan to demilitarize Japan, and yet it came back because certain very powerful interests in Japan like the idea of Japan as its traditional own vision of a powerful military nation. And they say that's the true Japan. The Japan that recovered after World War II to outsell everyone, having virtually no natural resources of its own, but the most the most intensely efficient distribution systems. In other words, they were really good at what they did, and the martial aspect of it meant nothing. But still, now you have China having been put upon by the military might of the West, and then Japan feels it must match them, not realizing that Europe and Japan, most people in Japan, would be quite happy to put aside the memory of those wars because of the destructiveness not only within their country, but within their souls. England never recovered from World War I, never recovered from the Somme, never recovered a sense of power and identity that it had before. And of course, European history textbooks always stopped after the First World War in this sense. You had the ancient world, you had the medieval world, then you had the modern world up to 1914, and that meant that there were themes within these things. But after 1914, the textbooks would say 1919 to 1939. Right,
like
1945 to the
together.
present. Yes, because there didn't seem to be any meaning in it, no sense of where civilization was going. It had been shattered in the crucible of World War I. And the competing ideologies of World War II kind of gave some kind of, against the totalitarians, right? But not real much unity, and now globalization is taking such a stage, it seems that's the driving force. The market is the driving force. But anyway, getting a little off the topic of war, but that's really rooted in those concepts.
Well,
who are you?
A lot of what you've touched on is so critical because obviously different places, different nations, different people, write their history, and countries clearly promote it in a way of both inculcating a certain set of values, beliefs, and maybe bringing together. When I think of this term nation, or actually nationalism, it's a double-edged sword. It has ugly parts when it's taken to some extreme, but there's another part where people feel a sense of pride and who they are. But the challenge, I think, of historians is, who writes that history and how do you understand it? Because when I think of Americans, and think of it today, any politician, we have a pretty widespread value that we have a certain level of exceptionalism. We help shape the modern world, and we do good, etc. Now, there are obviously critics who would say, wait a minute, we've got to think carefully because we live in a world today in the early 21st century where we can't quite shape it in the way we may have before, and we can't be the global policeman for everything. And that world order that we put in place in the mid-20th century is coming under tremendous cracks now. Maybe I'm just getting to the idea that for Americans, exceptionalism seems to be very important, and you can't have a politician who will survive in office if he doesn't somehow believe that or sell that. And yet, our worldview, our understanding of history is ours. It's slightly different from what you might get as a European studying history or as an Asian studying history. How do we decide, what is the history? Do you have to study all of them? And
well, one would hope so if you're a world historian. But there's something deeper in what you've just been saying. Every country feels that way. The smallest country in the world feels it's exceptional. We don't think of Switzerland as being imperialistic, right? But the Swiss have a very strong idea of who they are, and what they're doing is consistent with their image of themselves. The problem with great powers are when you have, and this is the evil of nationalism, you think that you are not only the greatest power, but you are entitled to exercise that power and reshape the world.
You almost have a destiny to somehow.
Well, we used to call it manifest destiny,
right.
yes. But I'll give you a kind of little vignette. I was being interviewed by Chinese television, and this idea indirectly of this correct view of Japanese relations. And it's like, how do you say about Japanese aggression in the South China Sea? And of course, the correct answer is, well, what about Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, right? But you can't have that dialogue. Well, we can, but they can't. But the important thing is, she said, but this is our history. And I said, but all nations lie about their history. And the interviewer, who was very young, looked at me with this shock on her face, and she said, they lie about their histories? And I said, of course they do. That's why you have historians. You have historians of contrary views that talk with each other and develop a consensus of what might actually be something more than what you want to see. And without that independent discussion, you can't, you don't even have any criteria to evaluate what you're doing. There is a very strong feeling amongst many people that the United States won the war in Vietnam because Vietnam is moving more towards a capital modern state, and it certainly is. But when the United States laid out what it hoped to achieve by putting 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, none of that did not appear on the list. That 25 years from now we will have a regime. Actually, they hoped for an independent South Vietnam that would be more like the United States, or at least in keeping with its interests.
So history gets revised, rewritten, reinterpreted.
And it is in Vietnam today, which Vietnam today is looking to the United States as its protector against China, which kind of shows maybe our thinking about China and Vietnam being partners for life was maybe an error. And that's the kind of errors you fall into when you fall victim to a lack of self-criticism and a feeling that, well, I'll give you one more anecdote because it's perfect. George Ball, an advisor to President Johnson, wrote a very famous memo, only read by about 5 people, that before the United States should contemplate going into Vietnam, it would lose 500,000 men as killed in action, and we'd be there 5 years, and we'd leave with our tail between our legs. And William Bundy, one of the even more closer advisors to President Johnson, although both actually knew him quite well, William Bundy said, George might be right, but we are the most powerful nation in the world, we've never lost a war, and if things go wrong, we can always just get out. And it's that confidence that you see in the way China talks about the South China Sea. We have a president who doesn't speak confidently about those things, perhaps because he's better trained. But it can also lead to paralysis. How do you know when action is absolutely necessary? The Iraq War, apparently, was not absolutely necessary, and it opened the Pandora's box of all these post-World War I issues that were just waiting to explode, and the removal of Saddam Hussein led to that. And you can imagine that presidents after that are going to think twice or 3 times before they do it again. But as you mentioned, what do you do with these new crises, which have a potential to spread around the world, but no more so than the time of the expansion of the Islamic empires of the past, and they're no more either. So you have to think about that.
I mean, so clearly history is important. We need it, and as a historian yourself, I mean, tell us a little bit about the craft itself and what is it that historians do, because on one hand, my sense is you're obviously interpreting the past, you're looking to it, but you have to, how do you do that? You look to different sources of information, and then there's an ongoing dialogue. Somebody writes this, someone else says, well, wait a minute, here's another take. I mean, speak a little bit about the craft of history.
Sure.
And
well, the craft of a world historian is kind of special because, people argue correctly that history doesn't repeat itself, and it doesn't. In fact, at the very moment where you think everything is going to happen in a certain way, it can change and happen completely differently. There's a thing called human agency. Great men and great women change things. On the other hand, what world historians are looking at are what we would call themes and processes, or history doesn't repeat itself, but the melody is the same. We know how nation states behave. So as historians, we look at how these nations are behaving, and from what they have done in the past, we have a pretty good idea of how things are going to run in the future. That doesn't mean they will, but it does allow us to alert the present to those legacies and those possible future outcomes. And if public historians do that, if historians just speak out and they participate in that kind of dialogue, it's usually very healthy. It's almost always dissent, because that national lust is so strong it can drown out any social scientist or historian. But what historians do is, you say, it's not so much collect data, but looking for the patterns.
And interpret it. Well, that's a fascinating thing, and as we come back, we'll have another short break right now. I'd like to talk a little bit about, who uses history, because as informed citizens of any, society, we're part of a democracy here, we need to be informed. We need to know what happened, and if we're making decisions about how to interact in the world. But even more than that, obviously policymakers look to history to understand and make sense of it. So we'll come back and continue this conversation we're having. I'm Carlos Juarez here on Global Connections, joined today by Marc Gilbert, a world historian, helping us take a careful look at some of the causes and consequences of World War in world history. So join us for more on this story.
Aloha, welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. My name is Josh Green. I'm the host of a program called Healthcare in Hawaii. I'm a physician. I work in the emergency department on the Big Island. I also serve in the state senate, which, please don't hold that against me, doesn't detract from my television program. We speak about all the big healthcare issues in the state. We get together on Tuesdays from 2 o'clock till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we try to talk about the most important issues in healthcare. This is a terrific venue for people to learn about healthcare. There are many programs on this station. We broadcast it later, not just on the internet, but also on OC16. Thanks for joining us. Please be informed healthcare consumers.
And welcome. We're live, we're back, and this is Global Connections here on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and today we're joined by Marc Gilbert, a world historian, talking about a range of issues, particularly World War and its place in world history. And one of the things we were just talking a little bit about the craft of history and or historians and how they do it, but I wanted to turn to maybe the question of who uses history, or why do we need history? And more specifically, I can think of, obviously, those who are making decisions about our role in the world, policymakers, or political leaders. They should have some understanding, you would hope, or at least those that are advising them. But even more than that, young people or future generations that are going to be leaders, they need to know some history for different reasons. But tell us a little bit in your sense as a historian, who uses it? Why do we need to know it? I think it's sad we live in a world sometimes where, people feel like you only need to know very practical things how to do this. But, if you're an engaged citizen, you should know something about where we've come from and help inform you. So,
yeah, there's an awful lot of discussion about, what kinds of history are there, how do people use it. I always like to say to my students, when you wake up in the morning, what do? Well, you review the history of the previous date, so to speak, and what you plan to do tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then if you break that down from in a multidisciplinary fashion, which is what world historians do, you look at issues of gender, job, economy, political identity. Almost all these things come up very quickly over a day in which you're living yourself in it. But there's something kind of deeper than that for world historians, because again, since we're looking for patterns, so well, here's a pretty good example. In the 1930s, there was a huge rise in Germany in an idea that one ideology should run the country. For Germany, it was fascism. Today, the prevailing idea in America is a free market, so that the free market can take care of everything. And unfortunately, that was kind of a part of fascism. Fascism did only wish to stop capitalism from causing unrest, but capitalism was encouraged by the state. And a writer by the name of Hermann Hesse saw this happening, and he said the university is doomed, because this interest only on money and making money and on business will destroy courses on cultures or the idea of thinking beyond just money. And he wrote a beautiful book that I think won the Nobel Prize in Literature called Magister Ludi, or The Glass Bead Game, and in which he talks about how that's going to happen, and of course it did. And so, but no one reads that book anymore. That is the destruction of the university system. So people don't realize, what is it? They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Well, how could that happen if you had a sense of connection to paradise? Well, now let's get to something more Hawaiian-oriented. There's a lot of discussion now about Hawaiian sovereignty, about whether Hawaii was actually annexed or not. And I've spoken to people who, on both sides, go right back to what they see as very hard evidence that it was annexed properly, and others that say, no, it was not. And these are represented by very powerful interests on both sides of that particular argument, way above the level of most, the average Hawaiian who thinks about it. And there's a great deal of money that is poured into both those sides. Well, if you've never addressed Hawaiian history, how would you know that that discussion could change your life? So becoming aware of these debates is one thing. Resolving them for yourself, which side I should take, well, those are decisions we make outside of history. We do it on the basis, hopefully, of reason or emotion or whatever, but we do make those decisions on our own. But the idea of the context of it, how do I think about who I am? What does Hawaii mean to me? Well, do you know about Hawaiian history? Can you connect with it? Do you know that the queen we love so much is married to someone who is not Hawaiian, and that the princesses were not fully Hawaiian? And if you understand that, or you want to accept that as a proof of multiculturalism, that's great. Does it mean it was okay for the United States to annex Hawaii? No. Would probably be the answer by many. But the idea is, how can you engage it when you don't know the basic, what we call basic facts, but we don't like facts. Facts are manufactured. There's a wonderful show going on now, Art Deco in Hawaii, Art Deco style, and there's a very famous painting almost all Hawaiians have seen, which is Annexation Day, and there's this huge party where everybody's delighted that Hawaii has been annexed, and even the queen is in there, not looking delightfully happy, but not opposed. And this was the image of Hawaii sold to Americans, that everybody loved annexation. Well, you need a historian to look at that picture with you and say, but nothing in this famous painting is actually true, except the very happy planters who are celebrating the annexation.
Well, and so, I mean, maybe another interesting point to me would be history. I mean, we learn it in school, it's taught to us on some level, and yet, what it is, I guess what I want to get at is, we should all continually be looking. So if you're coming and let's say you've moved here to Hawaii, I mean, it's incumbent on you as a responsible person to learn something about it and to do some reading and learn history, in other words. And I would ask you, I mean, how do we do that? Or what's the best way? I mean, even today we have bookstores that are disappearing, but you can certainly buy books online. But what are the kind of tips or advice that you would say? I mean, you're passionate about history, you read it, you write it, but others who may not, I mean, we certainly want to encourage people to stay informed.
Well, like seeing your first baseball game when you're young, or reading a great book when you're young, you have a tendency to have likes or dislikes from the very beginning. But our problem is we are making such an emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, that the national curriculums are leaving out history. In fact, they're almost leaving out all the social sciences, but they're putting history in a thing. It's like, well, it's part of a critical thinking skill. So you can use that discipline to kind of one of the ways. But the result is no one is teaching history in the way we used to. So you can't kind of gain a love of it from the environment in which it's devalued, and which the teachers of it are especially devalued as the general trend against humanism and a broad involvement in intellectual affairs. That, as it was at the time of Nazi Germany, is being brushed aside as unimportant. It's getting in the way. And of course, what we as historians like to say is, people with liberal arts degrees are the bosses of the people with the STEM degrees.
That's right.
That's the way it usually works out. So we're really hurting ourselves by this view. But not thinking about history and allowing a contemporary leader to make that history for you is very convenient. You don't have to think for yourself. Scapegoats are identified of who you should hate, and you can hate them, or feel that you are not successful because other people are getting ahead of you, and yet it's not those people who are actually running the system. That kind of thing, and that's what happened, of course, in Germany in the 30s. And that old joke, it can't happen here. Well, that can happen everywhere. This kind of willed ignorance, and that kind of brings us to where we started, which is every country at the beginning of World War I didn't want war. And China today, by the way, is very explicit. We are a pacifist country. We want no conflict. But they're ready for anything that comes. And that's what all the European states said. They said, well, we don't want war, but if it comes, we will fight them. We will fight it, and we will win. And of course, some didn't. But more importantly, all of them were shattered, where we started. And so if you have no way of seeing cause and effect in anybody's history, you can't see cause and effect in your own. You can't see, well, we used to scapegoat Jewish people or African Americans or Muslims. Right now, Muslims are blamed in India for any problem in India, and also now in Burma and in Sri Lanka, which has Buddhist fundamentalists condemning and harassing and harming people just because they're Muslims, not connected to and I think our problem there is that can't happen again everywhere unless we think of the consequences that history tells us comes from these kind of activities.
Yeah. No, very fascinating, and it's a cautionary tale because on one hand, as you noted, we have a world in which maybe the nature of our economies or the idea that somehow we have to be in more practitioner and practical sort of degree areas in school, but at the end of the day, you need people who have this understanding of the human experience and humanity. And as you noted, interestingly, many of those who studied liberal arts end up becoming the managers and leaders of the others. But at the end of the day, like a parent sending their child to school, often it's like, well, what is that going to do? Or why are you taking a course on, African history or Asian history? But clearly there's much more to it. I mean, you need that to be a well-rounded person. And frankly, if you look at it from a more practical level, I mean, this global world we're in, we have to understand it, and you need that knowledge of history.
Well, it's not, the thing is that now the knowledge we need is global. If you're working in a global environment with global customers, lawyers have to be trained in looking at international law. Businessmen need to understand their customer. What is that wonderful line? He doesn't know the territory. You have to know the territory. And as the environment becomes more international, then an understanding of who the people are.
Right.
Now, there are many ways. You can say anthropology or language studies. These things can help you better understand who those people in the world you're becoming closer and closer to. Well, understanding them better. The thing about history is it embraces psychology, sociology, anthropology. I started out as an anthropologist. So I can say that if you're going to have an undergraduate degree, I think there's some degree fields in the humanities that are better able to make you into a better boss and investor. And I'd imagine that history and anthropology in particular, since it's both in our college, our same college, that the social sciences are foundational points of which more specialized activities can be built. I would like to hire a businessman. Well, my wife is a perfect example. She was got everything but her dissertation in South Asian history, and then became an international high technology corporate attorney. And she never did very much work with India directly, but her understanding of the international environment in which increasingly Indians, people of South Asia, and Americans were living in, she was enormously successful with her South Asian contacts, clients in the United States and in India, and with everyone else, because she'd been trained to look more deeply into the sociology, anthropology, and history of each of the countries that she dealt with as an attorney. And she became a senior partner in one of the largest law firms in the United States, and that is something that is rare enough. That's true success.
It's a good example where, again, you might speak of a business person doing business with China. If you understand how they see the world, and how even the perspective of history that can inform that, you'll be better able to appreciate a very long-term perspective that they may have, or just again how it might be a different worldview.
Yes, and it's very important in the case of China, because China has two conflicting ideas about itself at the same time that affect all of its relations with everyone. And that is, on the one hand, they see themselves as victims of oppression for almost 150 years, and are a poor third world country just struggling to pull itself up by its bootstraps. And on the other hand, it's going to be the second, maybe first, it's already the second, it'll be the largest economy in the world. It will have a military second to none. It will be, let's just say, not as specific as they think. But the point is, global giant on the one hand, third world victim on the other, and it kind of explains why it's so hard to understand them. But once you understand that these two ideas are at war with each other, then you know how to address them. You can't just say, well, you're just like this, or you're just like that. No, it's much more complicated. It requires a very fine and careful touch.
Well, fascinating stuff, and again, I think just helping us understand the importance of world history. We've heard from Marc Gilbert here, a world historian at HPU, Hawaii Pacific University, and recently come back from China. I know you've done some trips there to share some of your knowledge and expertise, and you know, it just underscores really, I like to think all of us need to be lifelong learners. You might study in school and you know, even in college, but frankly, if you want to stay plugged in, I mean, history is continually being written, and you know, you have to stay up with it. So we've been talking here about some of the issues related to world history and world wars, this year being an anniversary for the start of World War I, and as we've heard already, I mean, in many ways, maybe the war never ended. It's just been one continuous saga. Thank you so much again, Marc, for sharing some of your insights.
Oh, real pleasure to be here.
And we're delighted to welcome him here back to Global Connections. I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us for one more episode, and stay tuned as we be back next week. We tape every Thursday here from 2 to 3, and we'll have some other great speakers in the following show. So look forward to seeing you then. Aloha.
Aloha.